Okay, so Kirby lore. We all know how complex it is, we all know how deep it is. It's one of the central components of the franchise that caused it to be this popular. The complexity of the lore is what attracted many players to dive on into it and start speculating upon it. It all started when bits of the story were told in a simplistic type of way. However, what has become the rise of explaining Kirby lore has now become one of the lore's biggest problems. Now brace yourself because as said before, Kirby lore can get very convoluted, so expect to be very confused as I discuss several topics. Some including my perspectives, or shall I say theories, on specific story bits. The storytelling in Kirby has always been divided into two segments. One segment is the main storyline where we as the protagonist witness the major characters introduced in the game. Everything is very direct, there are a lot of visuals and not much heavy exposition is really being dropped. Look at Triple Deluxe. The entire story was really flat until the very end. We had no clue who Termina was and why he was doing what he was doing. He served the role of chase them until the final chapter sort of antagonist. Then that's when they revealed their actual motives and character. Nothing was really happening in Triple Deluxe, and the developers were aware of that. Planet Robobot was a direct response to this. There were much more scenes and dialogue, the story mode was pretty straightforward, but even then nothing too drastic occurred when it came to dropping heavy exposition. Everything was more direct and simple. The other segment of Kirby's storytelling handles everything through pure exposition and implications. It's all conveyed through the extra modes that is unlocked in the post-game. These are the true arena and what-if scenarios that covers the background information and tells additional information that wasn't covered in the main story mode of the game. This is where the well-known pause screen descriptions take their place in the system. Pause screens are a way of dropping heavy exposition to the viewer by just dumping the background lore for a boss's background and so on. This has become a huge fundamental part of discreetly dropping the heavy or grim backstories that the surface of the game doesn't show you. It's done like this conceivably to not divulge the more mature and dark themes to the children audience. Once again, Kirby is a franchise mainly for children, but it also allows ways for adults to enjoy by shrouding the darker and the heavy themes. A lot of these themes and undertones, and notably the exposition, are not visually represented and is instead enclosed within the pause screens. Now in these pause screens, a lot of the exposition and storytelling will purposely be vague at times. Once again, this has a lot to do with censorship, but it also serves as a narrative device to allow the viewer to speculate on what is vaguely explained to them. It's up to the viewer at that point to piece plot points together and make up their conclusions that may match the story. However, a major problem is soon naturally met when this type of vague storytelling is implemented. Because in general, no matter what exposition is dropped in the story, there are bound to be surrounding questions that people may have despite how clear everything is explained. So now when the storytelling starts to become vague on purpose, things are taken a huge step further since the viewer is now meant to have questions and speculate. What happens then is that this also creates the after effects of making everything more obscure, unknown, unspecified, and unanswered, since there is no actual definitive answer. This again, of course, is very much common when stories are purposely made to be ambiguous. Again, it's a natural way to make the viewer ponder about and find answers on their own. But the problem here is that Kirby's not necessarily supposed to be entirely like this. The direction and formula of Kirby lore that we've seen throughout the game shows us that it's supposed to be able to remain consistent in its continuity. Almost every Kirby game always has a story concept brought back from previous games and applies them to new concepts introduced in new games. So what this means is that a lot of the information that's given to us has to remain fairly sensible or rational so that it can be used logically for a later concept that can be introduced in a later game. In simple terms, things need to be clear or explained enough so it can be utilized in a later game without it making no sense to the audience. Now, what storytelling Kirby suffers from is not necessarily the ambiguity, but rather the obscurity that completely overlaps the ambiguity. Let me explain what I mean by that. See, what a story's job is when it chooses to implement vagueness in its storytelling is that at the same time it needs to provide us with enough indications and hints for us to make observations off of. In that way, we have more insight and foreknowledge to speculate on what's to come next. However, when it comes to B, where the majority of viewers have ideas and speculations that are completely off than what the writers intended for the viewers to have, then that means something was done wrong. There's a difference between leaving the audience to speculate and confusing the audience. The exposition given was either not explained well or there was a lack of detail and information to the point where the viewers are misled due to the absence of definite information. This is what I mean by obscurity completely overlapping the ambiguity, where instead of intentionally telling your story in a vague and ambiguous manner, done for the purpose of leading your audience to theorize, the obscurity and unknown of it just completely butchers the ambiguity because it completely leads the viewer astray instead of leaving the viewer to theorize logically. Sometimes there is just not enough information or there is a heavy lack of details within these pause screens that there is no pure basis for the viewer to rely on. And the problem is, most of the major Kirby lore is told in these small little pause screens. A lot of the world building, major settings, story concepts, and heavy backstories are all smushed into these small little captions. Now this is also in sync with another issue that may be prevalent. As I said before, a lot of the exposition that's dropped needs to be evident, and every aspect of detail surrounding a story concept or rule needs to be acknowledged, so that when this concept is suddenly used or applied in a later game, it can logically make sense to the audience. I say this because when you start implementing new story rules or concept that's based off a previous concept that the viewer never fully understood, then they may see parts of the full story as contradictory or inconsistent, since they don't fully understand the concept at all because they weren't given enough information to understand it. Furthermore, and I will repeat myself on this, a lot of these short captions that are supposed to introduce entire story concepts in the overall franchise will rarely have any other chance to be explained any more thoroughly outside of their own game. This is unless the said story concept may be used later on, but still at that point it wasn't explained enough in the first place to have a good understanding of it. There's another major issue, which is also a huge part of this obscurity problem, and that is the infamous mistranslations of the pause screens. It's notoriously known even by the fans that it throws a whole wrench in the system. A lot of the Japanese text is altered a bit too much to the point where the important surrounding details of a story concept now misleads the audience from the actual original meaning of the text. And now again, I understand that many of these exposition drops that introduce these concepts are intentionally vague, but as I said before, the obscurity and undefined of it just doesn't help at all. But what's even worse is that there are times where huge pieces of actual crucial information are removed for no particular reason. All of these problems are most prevalent during Void Termina's debut, but we'll get into that later. Right now, let's talk about Planet Robot. Now, the ending of Planet Robot is filled with a lot of ambiguous overtones and sketchiness, mostly because of one specific visual moment in the final boss. Once Stardream, who is believed by Haltmann to be able to grant wishes, once it fuses with the Nova, a countdown eventually starts. As we've seen before, this means that a wish is about to get granted. However, when it reaches 0, it is unable to grant a wish, showing a message of a fatal error. Now, the reason for this fatal error could be due to a couple of reasons. If we go to one of Planet Robot's pause screens in the True Arena, it shows that Haltmann at one point believed that reactivating Stardream would allow him to have his wish granted from it, given that he directly states, "I should have known that no machine could make such a dream come true." Not to mention in previous pause screens, it clearly states that it was Haltmann's wish to see his daughter again after the accident happened. So it's made clear that his purpose of reactivating Stardream was to wish for his daughter back. However, his daughter, Susie, did manage to come back in her father's sights. So does this mean that the wish did come true? Before we dwell on this, there is something that also needs to be brought up that is yet another problem of storytelling in Kirby. That is Miiverse. Miiverse is yet another form of displaying exposition, but it's done outside of the games. It's usually done by the use of Q&As. The developers answer many questions that relate to the story. Questions that come from the audience. They also provide some additional information that was not covered entirely in-game. However, the problem is, a lot of the information that wasn't shown in the game were actually major plot points in the game's story, which would explain why the viewers held many questions. Now, what should have been done in the first place to avoid all of these major questions is to have all the information already be present within the game. Therefore, there would be no confusion. For example, a huge plot point that was unanswered in Planet Robot was Haltmann not recognizing his daughter. The thing is that this question can be somewhat answered if you look at a few hints in the game that will point towards one conclusion. However, said hints from the game already seem too vague to the point where it may not actually make that conclusion feasible. The vague hints would just make it seem like a far-fetched theory to believe. The big question is, why didn't Haltmann recognize his daughter, right? So here are the few hints that point towards why he didn't recognize her. Haltmann is shown using the program controller, and in that moment Stardream completely absorbs his mind. Fast forward to much later in the game, a hidden pause screen that can only be accessed when you're in the last level of the hardest extra mode. Dialogue coming from Haltmann himself is revealed. Dialogue that implies that he had gotten his memory back. This happens during the final phases of the Stardream Soul OS fight, implying that this dialogue is being said during that fight. Now, given this little revelation, this would somewhat imply that Haltmann's lost memories were stored within Stardream, and this would solve the case on why he couldn't remember his daughter. However, this doesn't give absolute confirmation that the program controller was the case. There was nothing directly stated to completely confirm this notion. There could have been a simple pause screen stating that Stardream had been absorbing Haltmann's mind with the program controller instead of an outside source telling us. That's not all. Miiverse also says something about how incomplete Stardream was, as in response to the questions of how Haltmann lost his memory. The game does indeed imply that Stardream is defective, therefore confirming that it wasn't able to grant wishes, which is why that fatal error occurred.
However, the problem here is at that point where Stargene fuses with the Nova, they are still both completely different entities. As we've seen before, Galacta Novas are capable of wish granting, though the game here for some reason implies that this specific one is not capable. What's also a weird inclusion to this is that the pause screen for this segment of the fight tells us at this point when Stargene fuses with the Nova, it has all of a sudden lost its own purpose due to Haltmann, its master, fading away from existence. And behind all of this, there's a huge unnecessary pause screen alteration from the Japanese to the English version that does nothing but add more confusion, for it creates a needless plot hole that the English localization could have simply avoided. While the Japanese version states that Haltmann's spirit is vanishing, the English version misstates this and instead says that his mind is being absorbed by Stargene. Now, those playing in the English version will misinterpret everything due to this alteration, and they won't understand why Stargene would lose his master and purpose if he never technically lost his master in the first place, if he was just absorbed as the English version says. Regardless, it's not so bad in itself, for it already seemed a bit nonsensical in the original Japanese version as to why Stargene would lose its purpose. There shouldn't be a reason why Stargene would lose its sense of self just because Haltmann is gone. The game had literally clarified just before that Stargene personally decided upon itself to eradicate all life based off of Haltmann's wish of eternal prosperity. So it would still continuously keep that goal in mind whether Haltmann was gone or not. Furthermore, if this is the case, then there wouldn't be a wish countdown in the first place if Stargene had permanently forgotten his personal wish, whether that be the Susie wish or the eternal prosperity wish. What it seems like here is that Stargene's little existential crisis is done just to cover up a questionable story bit or a potential plot hole that solely revolves upon the actual Nova itself. The fact that the Nova was unable to fulfill wishes is an odd case in the main story and in the backstory. Despite Stargene losing his wish, let's assume that the countdown was supposed to be fulfilling his wish regardless. Who knows? There's another thing that also gives food for thought. If we go back to Kirby Superstar, Marx's own wish of controlling Popstar is actually incredibly vague, for he doesn't really provide any specifics to what his wish actually means. A clue to it is then shown afterwards. The Nova that Marx gave its wish to is shown to nearly crash into the planet Popstar, possibly summing up what his wish meant. A conclusion that can be met from this is that Stargene's wish could be a similar type of wish where the Nova is using itself as the wish to eradicate all life, just like how the other Nova used itself with Marx's wish. However, this doesn't really solve the whole fatal error dilemma. Now here's what I mean by a story concept having contradictions or inconsistencies with itself, because there is a strange anomaly that happens regarding the Clockwork Star in Kirby Superstar Ultra that may have gone unnoticed. When Marx's wish is granted, Kirby first goes after the Nova instead of Marx, because regardless if he defeated him, the wish would still be in motion. So Kirby dismantles the Nova so the wish could be undone. Afterwards, he defeats Marx and destroys the Clockwork Star as a whole. In a later subgame that presumably occurs after Milky Way wishes, the Nova is resummoned, yet it's still in the same damaged condition. Then somehow, despite being unable to fulfill Marx's wish, it's able to fulfill Meta Knight's. Now many will look at this and still claim that the Nova was fixed because it was restored by the collected stars, though regardless, this would mean that there should be no reason for it to be in the same condition as it was before. If it was restored, then why would it be in the same broken state? So as far as the game is concerned, it's implying that this broken Nova is capable of granting a wish from a different user, despite being unable to fulfill a wish from a previous user. Let's put more emphasis into this because this is very bizarre. A broken Nova is still able to grant an entire full wish even though it was so disassembled to the point where it couldn't grant an earlier wish. I'll ask this question yet again since it seems very counterintuitive as to why the developers would show the same broken down Nova instead of just simply showing an intact Nova to avoid any discrepancies. Was this meant to be intentional, or was this just a weird plot mistake? Considering this Nova is literally fully animated in this finalized cutscene, and the directors or developers have no mention of it being an animation mistake, then we can assume that this was intentional. So therefore, this means that the clearly broken Nova, in stark contrast from the fixed Nova, is still capable of granting a wish. This game has this set in stone. Now, if we're taking this into account, and if we go back to Planet Robobot, then what would make this Galactic Nova so ineffective? If a Nova that is so advanced to the point where it's able to grant a wish even when it's broken, then how does an adequate one that only seems to be incomplete not able to do the same? Here's what I thought at first. In the True Arena Battle of Stargene, the English version says that Haltmann's soul has yet to be purged, which can throw a wrench in Stargene's plans.
I interpreted this as Haltmann regaining back his memory within Stardream and using his soul to rebel against it. Either Haltmann would order Stardream as its master to stop, or try to speak to the Nova itself to cancel out Stardream's wish. However, Haltmann would already be aware that the Nova would be unable to grant a wish since he had encountered it previously. Though he wouldn't know entirely if Stardream itself would actually be capable, but he would assume that it would be anyways since Stardream had awakened and held a desire that could be used for wish granting. Now once Stardream fuses with the Nova, Stardream itself becomes the Nova. Therefore it's able to grant a wish as a Nova presumably. But now since we have Haltmann in the mix that is throwing a wrench in its plans, it's now causing a fatal error to occur. Considering Haltmann's sentience is still within Stardream's sentience, both of their wishes are simultaneously spoken through one entity, which is Stardream as a whole. The Nova isn't able to process or identify one individual wish because they are being spoken through one soul. The wishes are overlapping each other, and therefore this overloads the Nova's programming, which is why the fatal error occurs. However, as we've clarified before, this wouldn't be the case, since shown in Superstar Ultra, a Nova can fulfill 2 wishes without issue while being broken. So this weird discrepancy or potential plot hole still exists. Why is this Nova so defective? Well, here's the answer. Wondering about this doesn't actually matter because it turns out that none of this is the case, since the Japanese version goes to specify that Haltmann's soul wasn't actually affecting Stardream's functioning at all, and it was just a minor nuisance that would soon naturally be deleted in time. So, all of those assumptions and interpretations that I made were invalid from the very start, all because of a mere rewording and translation that misled my thoughts. This here is one of the points that I'm overall trying to make. The sections of pause screens that are harmed due to the mistranslation or rephrasing of the text. While the whole incomplete Nova part isn't really that serious at all, what is serious is the spread of misinformation all because of the lack of insight on what actually needs to be said to get the proper information across. Once again, what also needs to be known is that the segments of storytelling that are meant to be intentionally vague, to the point where there really isn't a definitive say in the story, means that it's very vital that whatever translations there are, they have to be carefully reworded in a way that doesn't derail the audience to interpret it differently from what the author or whomever intended. Once you reword something even slightly differently, it may then potentially give off a different impression to the audience, especially if there's not enough background context surrounding it to give it a solid meaning. When too many of these little plot points that are important to the overall scheme of events are misconstrued, that's when everything becomes a complete mess. As I said, there is no actual basis for the viewer to rely on for them to make their conclusions off of. In this case, it wasn't about rewording. The English version added in something completely unnecessary that just absolutely threw off to what was pretty straightforward in the Japanese version. Now, there is possibly a way to avoid all of this, which I will highlight on later. It has to deal with this sort of over-reliance on pause screens that the viewer is forced to bear with. Now yes, the viewer is supposed to rely on these pause screens for exposition drops, yes. However, there will be times where there are variances between what is shown to the viewer and what is told to the viewer. Firstly, the viewer has to be led to believe what is first shown in the story, and henceforth they draw conclusions based off of what they saw. But then on the other hand, the pause screens may have a completely different say in the matter, which potentially invalidates what the viewer may have been thinking based on what the game itself has previously shown to them. The viewer is not at fault here. It's the inconsistencies between the visual game and the pause screens that diverts and restricts them from thinking for themselves. At that point, it's pointless to conclude something based off of the story if the pause screen is there to confirm something that would seemingly appear the complete opposite from what you concluded, based off of what you directly saw from the story. Now, when this happens frequently, the audience may be somewhat forced to have this reliance on the pause screens, since, as far as they are aware, and even as the developers signify, the pause screens are portrayed to be more of a credible source of exposition than the actual game itself, because now it's treated and represented more as something to primarily confirm and reassure what is actually true in the story as opposed to what the visual game shows to you. This is not the greatest thing to lie back on, since, as we've gone over, what the pause screen says will sometimes be in contrary to what the game presents to you. Even some of the ones that hold the most straightforward information instead of the vague, ambiguous ones can also be inconsistent to the game's storytelling. This all makes it very confusing to know what is actually supposed to be definite, what is actually supposed to be known. Like I said, there is no actual basis for the viewer to rely on if everything is mostly inconsistent. Here, I will present a much more broader example. This here is a huge component to the overarching franchise as a whole. and it suffers from what we'll call the separation of the visual screen and the pause screens. Here I present the Galacta Night timeline. Now, the writers purposely made this all to be vague and indefinite, but if they are willing to do this, then it needs to eventually be a proper conclusion to this timeline that can solve all of this mystery. Otherwise, there was no point for introducing Galacta Knight's appearances in this cryptic type of way in the first place. There doesn't necessarily need to be a direct exposition or explanation. In fact, that's what I'm going against. But there needs to be either a scene or something that can allow the viewer to sum up or plot these points together. Now I call this the Galacta Night timeline because his specific appearances involve him approaching or coming in from different points in time, different time periods. It involves a lot of time travel. Not to mention what's even more troubling is that on top of this time travel business, there's also the sections about the actual canonicity of his appearances, which bears fruit to even more uncertainty when it comes to trying to properly define this timeline. Some of his appearances have straight up either never happened, or has never actually happened, or is in a completely different canon. Don't worry, we'll get into it. But before we get started, just to confirm that I'm not stretching things or exaggerating things or being excessive in general, the developer himself actually encourages and insists the viewers themselves to try and speculate a timeline that Galacta Knight may follow based off of his appearances. Now, Galacta Knight's first appearance is in Kirby Superstar Ultra, in the subgame Meta Nightmare Ultra. Presumably, this happens after Milky Way wishes, since when Meta Knight summons the Nova, it appears as the same Nova that was blown up by Kirby in Milky Way wishes. However, many argue that this appearance is actually non-canon or a what-if scenario, because to what people claim, this appearance is in the subgame despite being various other subgames that are actually canon. Granted, it would be pretty weird for this to be canon because of the fact that Galacta Knight sort of dies. He doesn't retreat or get sealed back up like in his other battles, he literally perishes. Now, this would mark the end of his timeline if this was canon. However, the 20th Kirby Anniversary book does address this occurrence, but it doesn't directly emphasize the canonicity. Now, whether it's canon or not, this still means that this is Galacta Knight's endpoint. Although this wouldn't make sense since Galacta Knight would appear later on in future games, unless let's say this is a separate Galacta Knight being brought from a separate time period than the rest. What's odd here is that the Nova explains that the Galacta Knight was sealed, yet it says that it will summon the Knight once more. Let's ponder about this for a second, since as we know, Galacta Knight's appearances will involve him being brought from different time periods. Was this Galacta Knight brought from the past, or did he come from the present day? As far as we know, Novas don't use space-time portals as, say, Stardream does, unless one requests the Nova to do so. Furthermore, the cutscene literally goes to show an image of Galacta Knight sealed, yet the Nova summons him unsealed. And given the fact that Nova says that it will bring him back once more, it could either mean that it'll resurrect him from the seal in the past, or just resurrect him or summon him in the present day. It's very ambiguous, but overall speculating about this doesn't really matter because he dies anyways. Maybe the developers didn't know what to do with the character yet, so who really knows? Right now we'll just have to discard this appearance and considering an outlier among all of the rest of his appearances. His next appearance comes in much later in Return to Dreamland. Before we move on though, we have to once again include a point of canonicity. For henceforth, Galacta Knight will only appear in the extra modes, which at some points are considered either as canon or non-canon. The True Arena, the most reoccurring extra mode, doesn't have actual true presence to the main storyline of the game, but it does hold some merit of canonicity to it. As said by the developers and creators, the True Arena is supposed to serve more as a what-if scenario. There is a huge difference between extra modes being what-if scenarios and extra modes being completely non-canon side stories. What-if scenarios still hold canon elements despite the scenario itself not being existent to the central story. What-if scenarios are made up hypothetical situations that would drive the logic of the main story. This still means that whatever is revealed or may have already been pre-existent or present in the scenario is still apparent and true in the main story. It's just that the events of the main story that transpired never allowed whatever outcome or new information to be revealed to the audience that may have been revealed in the what-if scenario. A clear example of this is DDD Tour, another what-if scenario. Due to DDD's involvement in the main story instead of Kirby, the Amazing Mirror appears along with Dark Meta Knight emerging from it. Afterwards, DDD completely shatters the mirror. However, in the main story this never happens. The Amazing Mirror is not shattered because that what-if scenario never actually happened. But what is true from this is that Dark Meta Knight is still alive and has potentially escaped from the mirror in the main story. In fact, Kirby Star Allies confirms that Dark Meta Knight did indeed escape the Amazing Mirror. So what this all is essentially supposed to mean is that since Galacta Knight's true arena battles are what-if scenarios, this means that specific elements in what never happened is still true to the lore. It just never happened in the main story. Galacta Knight's battle may have never happened, but its very existence is confirmation of Galacta Knight being sealed in this area at one point of the story. The actual physical battle with him just never occurred. What needs to be done now is that we need to properly match up and outline Galacta Knight's timeline by splitting and differentiating events from what is canon and from what never happened. Because what gets triggered here is that there will be multiple events that have never happened, but since those events have been shown, what is existent or present beforehand technically means that whatever those events are based upon exists in the main canon. What never happened here is the fight with Galacta Knight in Return to Dreamland. But if this fight shows that a presumably present-day Galacta Knight is sealed, and he himself breaks out of the seal and retreats, then that means this still most likely happened in the main canon regardless of the cast fighting him or not. After all, nothing really contradicts this since he broke out of it on his own, not because of someone else's interference, but because he broke out by himself. So to differentiate this, these two scenarios unironically play out the same. The true arena we'll call what truly never happened, since there are other modes that are separate what-if scenarios, which we'll get onto right after this. So to separate these scenarios into different canons, what truly never happened is the Galacta Knight battle. Therefore, this means that in the main canon, he's within the seal and he eventually breaks out of the seal, and he leaves. The next time Galacta Knight makes an appearance is in Planet Robobot, in the sub-game called Meta Nightmare Returns. This here is an actual true what-if storyline, unlike the true arena, which is a single plot point to display one particular part of the lore. This one, however, is actually based upon an actual storyline. Instead of Kirby, Meta Knight is the main protagonist in this mode. This results in Stardream summoning a Galacta Knight. Now, pay attention to how exactly he is summoned. Stardream specifically says that he will be brought back from a forgotten time, and he is brought back through a space-time portal from an extra-dimensional road, and he is unsealed. Now, one could easily say that this Galacta Knight is the same exact Galacta Knight that is fought from Return to Dreamland in Haltmann. After all, Haltmann is in another dimension, which is the extra-dimensional road that he comes from. However, the director's post that covers this Galacta Knight appearance goes to imply that it's more discreet than one may think it to be. They describe how this appearance may not have a definitive spot in the timeline, due to one, the what-if scenario obviously, but most evidently, how the portal that he came from transcends space-time. Given that they emphasize this factor, and the fact that there are other several hints in the game, leads me to believe that this is a separate Galacta Knight. Because if this is the Galacta Knight from Return to Dreamland, then there would have been an authentic reason to completely stress this space-time factor as being a reason to obscure this appearance. For one, there is no type of difference or major change as far as we are aware from his presence in Return to Dreamland to him at a present time, which would be during Planet Robobot, right before he was summoned. If this really was Return to Dreamland Galacta Knight, then this one would just simply either be him summoned after that point in the battle, or him summoned during the present day. But no, the director pushes that the space-time portal gives a heavy difference. What I'm aiming at here is that the distinction from this is that this Galacta Knight is actually from the very distant past. As I said earlier, pay attention to what Stardream says. It will bring him back from a forgotten time, and he is brought back by the space-time rift. Furthermore, he is brought back unsealed, which could allude to the fact that he may have not been sealed yet during the time period he was in. And at the end of the battle, he is put within a seal. If this was Return to Dreamland Galacta Knight, he would just be able to break out of the seal like he did before. So therefore, this is not Return to Dreamland Galacta Knight. Also, there are the space-time attacks that he uses, which shows a lore Starcutter passing through. Now, this dimensional rift that he opens could just be a rift to another dimension during the present time, meaning that the lore Starcutter could just be Mogalore currently. Or, it could be a dimensional rift that shows his own time. What's weird about this is that in one of the posts, the director goes to tease us by asking questions of who the person in the lore Starcutter is, where are they going, and most essentially, what time are they from. Along with that, they bring up that individuals from both ends of the portal are able to see each other, meaning that the lore Starcutter and whomever is in it is able to see the battle through the portal, just like how we're able to see the lore Starcutter. As we know from later games, Galacta Knight is from a time period where the Ancients were prevalent, and as said by Mogalore, they also piloted lore Starcutters. So this Galacta Knight, given all of these suggestions, is most likely from a time where the Ancients were still alive. However, we don't know what particular time. Considering he isn't already sealed when he's brought through, it presumably may have been at a point before he was sealed for all of those eons, especially since he's shown to be locked within the seal after the fight is over, implying that was his first time, which is why he wasn't able to break out. So therefore, this Galacta Knight in the canon timeline, where this what if scenario never happened, is placed at the start of the canon timeline. He exists at a period where the Ancients were alive, he was eventually sealed, and after eons later, he breaks out during the events of Return to Dreamland. Something that is also interesting is the reason for Galacta Knight slicing Stardream. This is also explained by the director. Apparently, the reason he attacked Stardream because in his perspective, he was transported randomly by it against his will. This here can raise many questions, because for one, this means that Stardream possesses a tracking device on this Galacta Knight to the point where it transcends time itself. Now, whether this tracking device is homed in on whatever period Galacta Knight could be in, or only homed in on that particular period where he was summoned from, we don't know. This bears more food for thought since this possibly hits that Stardream at one point came into contact with Galacta Knight to the point where it managed to have an instant hold on him. This further brings up questions on how exactly these events line up, because what the Japanese pause screen says is that there are records of him in various eras. If this is the case, then Stardream has either physically witnessed Galacta Knight in the past during the moment where it may have put its homing device on him, or Stardream has constant data of Galacta Knight's whereabouts throughout time. This could theoretically mean that it could still have records of a present-day Galacta Knight, which, as we've seen from Return to Dreamland, is unsealed. Speaking of the present, there are some more questions to be asked about this. Stardream made a past Galacta Knight transport to the present day. What does that mean for the actual current Galacta Knight that exists in this day? Does he not exist anymore, or are there now possibly two Galacta Knights, one from the past and one in the present, coexisting at the same time? Well, overall, it doesn't necessarily matter thinking about this, since this occurrence never actually happens in real time. So in canon, Stardream never summons a Galacta Knight, therefore he exists in the distant past. The separate what-if timeline in Meta Nightmare Returns, where he is summoned by Stardream to the present day, is an appearance that occurs after Return to Dreamland, because he's being brought from the distant past that is antecedent to Return to Dreamland to the current time that is after Return to Dreamland. To plot this out, we'll have to place Meta Nightmare Returns in its own timeline, as in it never happened. Of course, all of it would be based off or followed by the true canon, since it's a what-if of the true canon. This would be placed at a point after Return to Dreamland where Planet Robobot would occur during the canon timeline, since he is brought to the present day of Planet Robobot from the distant past. And the distant past he's based off of in the canon time is way before Return to Dreamland. Now, we're not done with this yet. There is also the true arena, where his entrances are for some reason different than in Meta Nightmare Returns. Now, it's important to point out the fact that all side modes are not based upon or occur after the other side modes in any way. They do not have a definite timeline to follow. Such as right here, despite the fact that we see Galacta Knight return into the true arena with the same seal that he was given at the end of Meta Nightmare Returns, that doesn't mean that these what-if scenarios follow each other. After all, Stardream was sliced in half in one extra mode, yet is perfectly fine at the start of another extra mode. And even if these events did correlate with each other, it doesn't actually hold any significance since it's quite literally the same battle. Although what it could prove is that Stardream still has possession of this particular Galacta Knight, since after he is sealed back into another dimension, he is brought back once more in the true arena in which he breaks out of the seal. That's only if we consider these two events to happen sequentially. Since the true arena doesn't follow the other what-if scenarios, but is instead referred to as its own what-if scenario, we'll have to once again place it in a completely separate timeline, which is what truly never happened. Now, we don't know whether this was the Galacta Knight that was just sealed in Meta Nightmare Returns, or the Galacta Knight from Return to Dreamland who breaks out of his seal. After all, this time, he isn't brought forth through a space-time rift. However, it's the most safest, most obvious to assume that this battle would presumably happen somewhere after Meta Nightmare Returns. Also, his ending animation is much similar to that of the one in Superstar Ultra, where he literally rips apart and dies, implying that this time he isn't able to be sealed again because he'll just be able to break free. So the best we could say is that since this true arena fight is not based off of Meta Nightmare Returns, but rather the true canon timeline, is that this Galacta Knight may have been summoned from a point just before he was about to break out of his seal. Now, this may just be Return to Dreamland Galacta Knight, but who knows, and once again, it doesn't really matter since the true arena has less relevance overall since it doesn't have an actual bearing to the canon storyline unlike Meta Nightmare Returns. Up next is Star Allies, where he is summoned by Highness in a side mode called Guest Star mode, which appears to be another what-if scenario. Highness here summons him from a portal, which doesn't seem to be from another dimension. Moreover, he is brought here unsealed. This implies that this is present-day Galacta Knight, not a Galacta Knight from a past time. So we'll place Star Allies in the true canon timeline as one of his last appearances, occurring after Return to Dreamland. This what-if side mode shows that Galacta Knight is somewhere in a different dimension unsealed in the canon timeline. Since Galacta Knight is able to travel through dimensions, we can assume that he may have traveled out of Haltmann from Return to Dreamland to somewhere else until he was summoned by Highness and Star Allies. But then, something different occurs in this side mode. Galacta Knight is fused together with the Butterfly of Paradise or whatever and turns into Morphinite. We'll talk about that later. While this technically never actually happens in the main canon, it still can potentially happen. Nothing truly special happens in this battle, but the ending does show some substance. Morpho Knight's death animation has him fade away in a sparkle and is somewhat lifted upward towards a bright light as he fades away. Given the pause screen implications of him going to paradise or whatever, again we'll get to that later, we can say that he probably died or his spirit has went into a heaven realm. This may have gone unnoticed to most, but his death animation or exit animation looks oddly similar to Mogalor's when he vanishes. I'll point out, it's revealed that after he vanished, Mogalor somehow reappeared and roamed within another dimension until he found a way out. Now, in the true arena of Star Allies, the pause screen for Morpho Knight EX's battle depicts that it's during the time after the Guest Star Allies battle. In addition to that, the area Morpho Knight EX appears in is the exact same area where Highness was when he opened the path to another dimension. This means that when Morpho Knight vanished from Guest Star Allies, he did appear in another dimension, as the true arena confirms. However, as you would expect, this true arena fight never happened. This would mean that in Guest Star Allies, after vanishing, he would just be roaming around in this area of another dimension, much like Mogalor did, and he would be mastering his abilities as the pause screen says. However, the true arena version shows him vanishing once more after he is defeated, so it's unknown where he ended up after that. This is all we know about Morpho Knight and Galacta Knight right now. So, in the canon timeline of Star Allies, Galacta Knight is still unsealed in a separate dimension. Guest Star Allies in the Never Happened timeline has Morpho Knight being born and then sent into the same dimension Highness was in within another dimension. In the True Arena's own What Truly Never Happened timeline, it has Morpho Knight vanish once more. Now again, it's possible that this True Arena could be based off of Guest Star Allies as an exception from the rest of the True Arenas not being based off the other extra modes. The reason why I say the True Arena from Planet Robot is not a continuation of Meta Nightmare Ultra is due to the contradictions of Star Dream being sliced, but as I said, even if they were to be sequential to each other, there is no actual significance from it since there is no major difference from the two battles. However, this True Arena has a major difference from Guest Star Allies, and that is the fact that the battle occurs in the area Morpho Knight was implied to go to after Guest Star Allies. Even the pause screen hints at this. But if this True Arena is based off of the main canon, then that would mean that in the canon timeline, Galacta Knight would have to have eventually be fused with the Butterfly for the True Arena's battle to occur in the first place. This is why I said it's potentially possible that Galacta Knight could have fused with the Butterfly in the main canon, but we can't directly assume that it happened. So, as an exception, this True Arena battle seems to be based off of Guest Star Allies, or a continuation of it. Going off topic here, the bit about Morpho Knight is that as the game itself goes to imply to you, both Galacta Knight and the Butterfly merged into each other. The friend heart is what gives it away, and in the pause screen and even in the Kirby Star Allies official art book, it suggests that this even more. The reason why the Butterfly is able to take on this Knight form is because of Galacta Knight's body. They fuse together. Isn't this right? But moving on from that, Galacta Knight's appearances are not over just yet. They are still the matter of Super Kirby Clash, which is a completely separate canon, but it has allusions and suggestions to point at the original Kirby canon. This game here shows us new information of Galacta Knight that had not been revealed. It's all more relative to the Galacta Knight from A Forgotten Time, where he was called Eon Hero. So what happens first with Galacta Knight is that he is summoned by Nightmare unsealed, and then he retreats. He is then fought once more, and he retreats again. Now here's when events split, because the next fights are not sequential with one another, because they are both different endings. One ending is when Galacta Knight or Eon Hero is fought in his light form. When he is defeated, he disappears in almost the same way Morpho Knight and Mogalor do. So, he may be in the same place Morpho Knight EX was in. It's unknown for the most part. In another ending, where he is defeated in his dark form, he is instead sealed away. Now, who knows where he was taken to? But what's weird is that the Super Kirby channel said that this dark form may appear again someday in another world. Now, they can't be hinting that this Eon hero will cross over with the actual Kirby canon. That would make everything all the more complicated. Although, why would they emphasize with a different ending and then lead on that he'll appear in a different world? Maybe it's just them indicating that he'll appear back as he has already appeared in the true canon. After all, it is him from the distant past. When and where he is specifically seems to be explained by a few other implications from the main games. Now, in one of the main games, such as Kirby Star Allies, Highness says that he and a few others were able to put a stop to a nightmare of a galactic crisis eons ago. This Galactic Knight obviously is shown to be from that time. His space-time attack shows a Jamba heart, and furthermore, he's brought forth from Nightmare himself and has yet to be sealed. So, Eon Hero could be placed in reference to the main canon right with Planet Robobot's Galactic Knight, since he was also unsealed and from a forgotten time. However, since Planet Robobot's Galactic Knight doesn't have the same armor as Eon Hero, then it means that Eon Hero is before Planet Robobot's Galactic Knight. And this here is the Galactic Knight timeline based off of my understandings of what the game shows to us. Now, I went through the trouble of explaining all of this, not just to give more insight on the intricate lore, but to point out something else. I brought up that this Galactic Knight timeline business is a broad example of the separation of the pause screens and the visual scenarios itself. What I've done to try to connect the dots is use the visual hints of the scenarios as Miiverse intended for me to do. I tried to make sense of everything by looking at the details, the settings, the dialogue, the seals, the portals, and the information outside of the game. Something I have not mentioned at one part of this whole thing is that once again, the Japanese version has a different say in the matter that was left out in the English version. The Japanese version, in one of the pause screens, goes to state that Galactic Knight had been sealed numerous times in different eras. This may not seem troubling at first, but this potentially means that all of these appearances don't actually matter. It invalidates his whole timeline, since this means that any Galactic Knight could have been summoned from any point in time. As far as we were aware at first, Galactic Knight had only been sealed away once at one point in time. That's what I initially used to put his appearances in the sequence. Whether he came unsealed and then was later put in a seal in one appearance, I would assume that he must have not yet been sealed permanently, so this would mean that this Galactic Knight would come from a time before he was put in a seal. It was all a pattern to follow. But now if he's been sealed multiple times during multiple eras, then it takes away from the whole point of trying to analyze where he may have came from. The Galactic Knight from Planet Robot could have been from any point in time. He could have came when he was already sealed away after the Galactic Crisis. He could have came from way before, or he could have came from way after. We don't know the actual legitimate events, since there's literally no distinction between the Galactic Knights that would hint at one being after a specific time. There's nothing to show what eras he's from. So all in all, these appearances don't really have any significance at all, if they're all quite literally generally the same thing. There is no distinction between the seals that he's been in to indicate the order of events. It's all the same seal. What could have been done to show the differences, such as the seals being stronger than the previous one, which would explain why Galactic Knight wouldn't be able to break out in one like he did to another seal, is to maybe show different colored seals to indicate the points in time. Now we don't actually know anything. The Galactic Knight in Return to Dreamland could still be present day Galactic Knight, but now we have to deal with the information that he's been sealed multiple times before, and not sealed directly from where he was from Planet Robobot. And even there, he could have been sealed beforehand. Is there a point anymore? And forget about Superstar Ultra, it literally shows him with the seal, yet he's summoned without one. We have no idea where he came from, especially when considering this new information. And that's the problem. All the visuals and hints I've used to try to formulate a thesis, it's all swept aside and compromised due to what this one little pause screen says. Unfortunately, I have to put this over-reliance on the pause screens to tell the story, since it's a confirmation of everything. It's there to rectify things, it's all set in stone. But this just ruins the whole visual storytelling in each of the games by making all of his appearances not hold any real value. Now if they're making this pause screen the case, then how would they explain Galactic Knight's past in later games? How would they explain the various specific eras he was sealed in? Because now, according to this pause screen, Highness's claims of him being sealed at one point in time would now mean that wasn't the only time he was supposedly sealed. Not to mention, as stated by the director, Highness's claims were already supposed to be portrayed as vague, so Galactic Knight being sealed in his claims may not even be true itself. Is our explanation of Galacta going to be yet another vague and obscure pause screen that may be worded unclearly and then reworded differently or mistranslated in the English localization, which would further leave out information which would confuse the audience even more? See, they made all of this build up all to unveil the mystery of Galacta's past in these appearances, only for it all to not really matter because it's all the appearances are generally the same thing when you really get into it. What would be more important now is instead showing him appearing and appearing, is to now specify where he came from and what period he is from. Then they can maybe explain what was going on during those time periods to give better insight on these Galacta appearances, and therefore they have much better involvement in the backstory of the franchise. But clearly this isn't the case since it was never and may never be specified on how and when he was sealed multiple times. Like I said before all of this, the separation of the pause screens, the visual story, and even the Miiverse, the outside source, it's all so bad for the viewer's sake because there are discrepancies or conflicting information in all of them. Using these 2 to 3 different ways for the sole purpose of telling your story or giving exposition to the audience, it instead confuses them. Furthermore, these outside sources, not everyone will be able to see them since it's outside of the game. So, this is an even bigger thing you shouldn't heavily rely on to give exposition, especially if it's important to the overall plot. One example is Triple Deluxe, where nowhere in the game was it stated that the amazing mirror corrupted Sectonia, even with the mirror being shown in-game. This huge plot point had to be revealed outside of the game. While Sectonia's corruption isn't a necessity for understanding the story of the game, it's still a huge insightful bit in the story that should be known, and therefore it could have simply fit in a little pause screen, as simple as that. And it's not like this is the only example. A lot of questions were asked regarding the backstory in Planet Robobot which had to be answered in Miiverse. Now granted, many of those questions were actually already answered within the game. However, the plot point that confused many of the viewers, as I said before, was how Haltmann didn't recognize Susie. This led to many people thinking that Susie may just be a robot or a clone. This plot point of Haltmann not recognizing Susie had to be explained outside of the game so the story itself could make sense. When you're forced to explain your story and clear up numerous questions externally, then that means you never told the story correctly in the first place. External sources should never be a way of trying to clarify or explain your story unless it's used to give out minor details that aren't major components of the important plot points. There are also some more examples of these sources having conflicting information. In Miiverse, it is said that Haltmann had gathered data of the Holo Defense API. However, in the game, one of the pause screens says that Susie was the one who actually acquired that data. So who's the one that actually acquired it? Now this can all be avoided. There can be a way to not have everything be forcefully explained through Miiverse. Let's look at an alternative. What needs to be done here in the first place is that there has to be a balance of information inputted into these 3 types of exposition drops. That being the visual game, the pause screens, and even the outside source. In this way, there are no obscure discrepancies that the audience can get confused from. Therefore, their preconceived notions and theories based upon what information they were given from those 3 types will not be so far stretched. However, when approaching some of these exposition drops, a lot of them feature heavy and dark storylines as said earlier, so I have to understand that many of the pause screens has to be downplayed a bit because of the young audience. After all, no kid is supposed to be overly aware of pagan maltheists or cults making rituals and sacrifices to resurrect an ancient malevolent deity. Funnily enough, all that happens explicitly in the main story mode of Star Allies. But here's the alternative. We'll start off with Kirby Triple Deluxe, since it has more narrative themes and heavy overtones. So, you're playing the game for the first time. You had completed the main story and you had just beaten the arena and DDD tour for the first time. The true arena is unlocked. But then, this happens. After this, you're brought back to the main menu with a text box appearing and saying, "Complete the true arena to unlock all remaining cutscenes." It introduces you to a separate story that may captivate your open eyes. This story shows Termina, who is oddly happy in this scene. He may or may not have completely gained your trust as a redeemed character given that he was a main antagonist, but you're still interested of what this depiction of him has to bring. Termina places down this huge gift box that he's been carrying. As it's placed down, the note on it says, "For Sectonia." Suddenly something doesn't seem right. Right after, a girl that looks just like Termina turns around and smiles. the cutscene ends, it ends on that cliffhanger. Everything is suddenly different now. Lots of questions are present now. The girl who was supposedly Sectonia, who is she really, and how did she come to be? Where did she come from? What is there in the box? How would the next cutscene play out? You're given time to catch your breath and ponder about this, for the main menu doesn't appear until after 10 or so seconds. Now there is much more engagement. The game has presented to you something griping, so you can be bent on beating the true arena. There is an actual purpose now for going through this most difficult mode, and that is to unravel the mystery and reveal the backstory of the game. The more you go through and beat these bosses, the more cutscenes are shown to you. However, these aren't permanent. Say if you lose, you will no longer be able to see the cutscenes you've already seen until you've finished the entire mode. This progressive type of gameplay that rewards you in this subtle way urges you to actually want to push on through these hard trials so you can discover all of the pieces of this separate story. This puts in a lot more catharsis to the gameplay, for now there is not just an urge to overcome the trials of the true arena, but now there is even more of a reward for the player to receive. Each time a cutscene is disclosed to the player, the more they would want to see what else the story would unveil to them, and therefore they'll play more so they can know more. There is a lot more agency driving the player's need to play the game, and eventually, the climax of the hidden story will be met once they approach the final boss. The story that they've went through and fought for will come at a satisfying conclusion. The mystery will be unraveled. As of now, let's say you've gone through a third of the True Arena's boss fights. After you've beaten Coily Rattler, another cutscene is activated, and now it shows this. What the gift box holds inside for the girl is actually the amazing mirror that you've seen in DDD Tour. You then recall that the mirror didn't hold many generous things. But still, what exactly does this all have to do with this girl that is supposedly Sectonia? Afterwards, some screen time of her and Termina are shown. They are interacting radiantly with each other, showing that they are very close. And the cutscene ends with the two of them hugging in front of the mirror. The girl is thankful of the gift from her beloved Termina. So after the second round of the mid-bosses that you fight, there is now instead a shorter cutscene with her holding a familiar and recognizable crown. Termina here is shown to comfort her in this scene, implying that maybe she is anxious to what appears to be her being put with more responsibility. This can distinguish whether she made herself queen or if she was appointed towards it, since the game we have never actually tells us. After beating Krakow DX, another cutscene is triggered. However, it doesn't actually seem to be a full-on cutscene. It's a very vague and weird repeated or looped scene of the girl staring into the mirror as days and nights go by. What is shown in the mirror is the actual Queen Sectonia that we know. And right after this scene ends, we're led to finally battle Queen Sectonia DX. Now, to avoid issues of people misinterpreting the cutscenes, the hidden pause screens can still take its role, but now it serves more as clarification of what happened in the scene. This time, it won't have any conflicting information that interferes with the cutscenes. Now, no discrepancies can be met by the viewer. Queen Sectonia DX's pause screen doesn't have to be changed from the original, but it can use some further confirmation of the mirror being what corrupted her. Therefore, it can clear up some confusion, whereas some may misinterpret that Sectonia is not the girl, but rather the bee in the mirror. The pause screen can clear this up by portraying that the girl is the one that eventually ends up transforming into the bee. Now granted, the prior cutscenes clearly imply that the girl is indeed the Sectonia we know because of her name being involved with her and the crown that we see. However, there is nothing wrong with using the pause screen as further confirmation. The viewers can then understand that the scene of her seeing herself as a bee in the reflection is only there metaphorically, and that the bee isn't a separate character from her. The pause screen can include this confirmation, but what's most important is that the cutscene in itself, on its own, is the one that is conveying all of this. The pause screen is just an additional component of understanding the scene. The cutscene on its own should be the most self-explanatory and credible, to the point where the viewer, without looking at the pause screen, can piece together that she was corrupted by the mirror. See, this provides more flexibility and room in the viewer's mind, since everything isn't directly told to us. It's being shown to us vaguely, but explicitly at the same time. Most importantly, it's not relying on being told. So now, right after two long, grueling battles with Shadow DDD and Dark Meta Knight, The final cutscene is there to answer all the questions that may still lie in the viewers' heads. The cutscene shows silhouettes of the people of the sky being hung up by strings that look awfully similar to Tyran's parasitic powers of leeching energy from other life forms. But here, these strings are coming from the girl. The girl is leeching power from them, and eventually, in the cutscene, she transforms into the tyrannical queen that we know today, Queen Sectonia. That's the final cutscene. And afterwards, you finally approach the true final boss, the soul of Sectonia. All this build-up throughout these sequences and cutscenes is now intensified into this one pinnacle moment right before the true final boss. There is now added pressure from all the revelations shown to you about the being that you are ultimately going to fight against. The truth is disclosed. You are again given time to process everything in your mind and think of the circumstances, how shocking it is that things came to be, and how severe the situation is. The final battle is dramatically delivered to you through these culmination of events. This final boss now holds much more gravitas and magnitude due to the build-up and emotional weight throughout these cutscenes. Now you fight this final boss with knowledge of its tragic past, its true story. There's a lot more insight, a lot more understanding. Where at first you had no sympathy for this boss, just seeing her as a one-dimensional villain of the story. Now you see her as a tragic, broken individual. This entire battle is a culmination of devastation, suffering, and agony. And if you dare yourself to look at the hidden pause screen, it provides to you the inner monologue of the boss, which enunciates the tragedy built up throughout these cutscenes. This is the entire point of the true arena, to unveil the truth of these final bosses. After such a grueling battle which took your utmost patience and endurance throughout these trials, you receive a different ending and complete the true arena. All the cutscenes are now unlocked and available to play in the theater. The entire story is unraveled. This is your reward. You see, this here provides much more depth to the game, and allows the player to be a lot more involved and committed into the gameplay. And to conceal the heavy themes and storylines from the younger audiences, everything is presented in a way where it is foggy or obscure enough to where they may not entirely get what exactly is happening. There is no dialogue, no narration to explain all that is happening, and visually the cutscenes aren't explicit enough to allow the viewer to actually have a 100% certainty of what is going on. This also provides the viewer to use their own mind to imagine and plot the points together after seeing the obscure visuals making up the cutscenes. And if they still have trouble understanding, the pause screen is still there to help them. Although it's still specifically worded in a way where it is exceptionally vague, but can still properly convey exposition by allowing the viewer to think on their own, and not just straight up drop straightforward information down. On top of all that, it's all concealed behind the most difficult mode in the game, which the kids may not be able to progressively beat. This is almost perfect. There's potentially no room for unwanted confusion from the audience. This is even a perfect way to show more pre-rendered cutscenes, helping the game even more. All this removes the extremely flawed way of telling plot points through Miiverse like in Planet Robobot. What could be done there instead is now the game itself could show simple scenes of Haltmann going planet by planet and conquering them, as Miiverse said. The teaser cutscene this time could be Haltmann at a younger age doing paperwork and looking out into space. As the cutscene ends, then there could be a sudden reveal of a younger Susie. Then, right before the Susie 2.0 boss, it could show the dramatic event of Susie getting transported away in the Stardream incident. A few bosses later, before the Haltmann 2.0 boss, Haltmann can be shown grieving and then pleading on his knees in front of Stardream. Then there can be a few clips of him approaching planets, implying that he may be searching for something, and then he approaches the Nova, and the cutscene ends. The last cutscene just before the final boss can be clips of Haltmann repeatedly tampering with the program controller as he places it on his head. Each clip gradually shows him losing his mind, and eventually he wakes up with a sinister look on his face. Now this may require a pause screen or two to explain that Haltmann lost his memory, but if we chalk everything up to the pause screens during the Stardream OS fights that speak of Haltmann's memories along with his mind being absorbed and him regaining his memory, the viewer can probably sum it up there. The pause screens now, mainly because of these cutscenes, are much more clear cut than before. All of this in return naturally clears up the confusion over Haltmann now recognizing his daughter, since now the answer can be logically summed up within the game instead of being answered from outside of the game. Of course, there may have to be some dialogue in these cutscenes to add more details, since Planet Robobot's backstory is a bit more intricate. However, this doesn't do a disservice to the viewing experience like the pause screens did that were nothing but just measly exposition dumps that had little to no impact to the audience. Instead, in this alternative, the pause screen adds on to the moment by serving as confirmation and further info for what happened in the scene. Like I said, it's now more of a component instead of strictly relying on itself to convey exposition. This is the goal. I'm not saying that pause screens have to be removed to fix the problem, it's just that they shouldn't be relied on because they aren't strong enough to hold and explain major plot points that require more insight to be fully understood. This alternate way is a lot more moving and impactful, for it directly shows you and gives you a vision of what the themes are and what the characters went through. Plus, this visual way of showing you instead of strictly telling you the story is a better way to lessen the confusion for the audience. This alternative makes everything vague but not too obscure, solving the problem of obscurity overlapping the ambiguity as I said earlier. However, this alternative may not be a solution to everything. It's just only significant to the narrative and thematic aspects of the game. So it may not be capable of being used to cover strictly the lore aspects themselves. Kirby Star Allies is one game that features huge amounts of heavy lore. It brings a lot of new world building, new story concepts combined with old ones, different settings, and different characters alongside old characters. Also, the pause screens in this game is based on the background lore and world building, so putting cutscenes over these cryptic and broad topics that don't strictly or necessarily have to do with the main story of the game is very irrelevant and unorthodox. What I do suggest, however, is still let cutscenes be placed for the three mage sisters. Matter of fact, Star Allies does indeed share problems from its predecessors, such as once again not telling the backstory in the game. It's actually way worse here. The backstory to this game actually has a high importance, for it somewhat covers Highness's background and how he, his cult, and the Jam of Heart came to be. The only place where any of this is explained is found in Nintendo Dream Magazine, another outside source. This information tells us that there was a religious book involved that told about Void Termina called the Book of Legend. It also tells us that Highness at one point had a vision and believed that resurrecting Void Termina would bring this vision to life. It even tells us that something that should be known. That is the fact that Highness summoned the Jam of Heart from another dimension. While the game does technically mention this, the game words the mention in a way where many can misinterpret it, but we'll get into that in a bit. So, I can understand that maybe a lot of this wasn't shown or told to us in the game due to the extremely controversial themes of religion and cults that the game quite literally already has a lot of. Star Allies was a lot more explicit on its themes than any other Kirby game. It has themes of suicide, rituals, sacrifice, and monotheism. Although I still do think our alternative cutscene route can still play a part here. It can start off with a very ambiguous scene of Highness that appears more gentle and benevolent. He then looks up at the sky and sees a bright light and is then bewitched and gratified by it. The next scenes, however, can actually cover the three mage sisters' past. Francisca, one of the first bosses, can have a simple scene of her stranded in a snowstorm, freezing to death as a hooded entity arrives to her and unlocks her ability of Ice Masher. The same can go for Flamberge, for her premise is quite literally the same. However, for Zan Partisan, things need to be a bit different because her past actually involves attempted suicide. This was obviously censored in the English version, so we have to be careful on how to depict this backstory of hers. What can be done here is that we can still have her climbing up the tower with a distressed look on her face. She looks up at the sky and then looks downward the tower for a split second. Suddenly, in a zoomed out shot, lightning strikes the tower. Then the camera is placed in the point of view of Zan's eyes opening slightly. She sees the same hooded figure who then strikes her. She then looks down at her hands and sees electricity spark from them. Now the rest of the cutscenes goes back to Highness. There can be a few clips of Highness and the Mage Sisters praying benevolently and treating each other like family. That is until there is one scene of Highness drifting away from his people as they're praying, showing that he is detaching himself from the rest of his Jambastion clan and the Mage Sisters. Then the scene will show himself secretly getting enraged because his prayers aren't being answered. It'll show him trying to pray, but isn't able to focus because of his rage fist. Afterwards, he'll look through the Book of Legend and find depictions of Void Termina's resurrection. The final cutscene would then show the visual transition from good to evil, and that would be Highness finally putting on his hood, showing the cold-hearted detached Highness. And finally, the Jam of Heart is shown arriving from a dimensional rift, and the cutscene ends. This is probably the best it can be as for putting the backstory in. The game does actually have some mention of the Book of Legend and of the Jamba Heart being from another dimension, though the game never hints of the book's significance behind this, as it was one of the main reasons he started the Jambashan religion on his own. Plus, in the English version, it's just referred to as Ancient Scrolls. With the Jamba Heart, it was never really directly stated to have come from another dimension. This factor is actually very important to know, for it deals with the new story concept, and that is Void Termina's rebirth cycle. So this here, Void Termina, and what I'm calling its rebirth cycle, is a huge overarching story concept that had just been introduced into the franchise. This newfound story concept affects past games to the point where it may create some retcons. Now this is why I said the usage of cutscenes this time may not be a solution when covering the lore aspect of things. Pause screens here now have to be a sole factor and has to be self-reliant, for this portion of the game now needs to be told to us in direct exposition, so I can excuse the pause screens here. However, what this means is that we have to put a huge reliance on these pause screen texts, and as we recall, that didn't go very well before. Misconceptions, mistranslations, rewording, and information being left out all occurred. Hopefully that doesn't happen this time. So it's worth mentioning that this direct information is more so cryptic on purpose, like at a few other times before. So therefore, I can't take everything that's said as a complete fact. This way I won't be misaddressing anything and miss the whole point of what's actually supposed to be told to me. However, as I said before, there needs to be a basis of reasoning to rely on, a basic understanding of what is being told to us. So let's get on into this. The idea of Void from its descriptions is that it's a malevolent celestial being that was born through neglect and dark energy that Highness and the Jamba Heart were comprised of. Once Void Termina is released from its shell, pause screens reveal that the ancient scrolls, or rather, the Book of Legends, say that Void Termina will rise again in different forms based upon what type of energy is gathered before it's rebirthed. As we know, it's extremely heavily implied that these different forms are Kirby and dark matter. There are an abundant amount of hints than ever before in the pause screens in the visual game that imply this. However, there is no denying the fact that Void Termina is indeed the origin of Zero, or dark matter, as opposed to it also being the origin of Kirby that people may not believe. So if we're taking this into consideration, we have to apply this to the past appearances of dark matter when it comes to trying to line it up with this rebirth or reincarnation cycle of Void. The first appearance of Zero, who is the source and nest of dark matter, comes before Zero 2. Now what's odd here is the fact that these two are depicted to not be the same individual, but rather two separate entities despite having the same exact qualities. Even in the Kirby 20th anniversary book, it's stated that it's unknown if the two are connected or not, despite being completely made of dark matter. Now if this is the case even today, we have to consider these two as separate reincarnations of Void Termina. However, the glaring problem that appears is the question of how Void Termina comes back if it's already been reincarnated. As a matter of fact, even if we don't consider Zero 2 or even Kirby in this matter, how does Void Termina come back sealed in a Jamba Heart after it's already been reborn as Zero? You see, it doesn't really add up. How does Zero, Zero 2, and even Kirby coexist in the same universe if Void Termina had already been reborn once? How is it able to come back to be reborn as something else? See, if these characters coexist together, then that means they were subsequently subjected to Void Termina appearing or coming back multiple times to be reincarnated as them in the first place. Now, what I haven't mentioned yet is something else that was written in the pause screens, which was, you guessed it, left out in the English version. However, let's look at something in the English version first. Void Termina is stated to exist in all dimensions, but his shining form from another dimension inspired the ancients to transcribe his mysteries in sacred texts, or rather, in the Book of Legend. Many people were misconstrued at this pause screen, for while to be fair, it's actually correct on what it says, it's still written in a way where it can be misinterpreted. Many thought from this pause screen that Void Termina was an omnipresent singular being that spanned its presence and existence across all dimensions. But this is not actually the case. The Japanese version specifies this more by saying that Void Termina rather transverses dimensions instead of transcending them, meaning that there are one voids per dimension. What proves this is the mention of a shining void right after this. This shining void is a void from another dimension that we mentioned previously. And in actuality, this is the same void that we see in this game. Since it was quite literally never shown in game that the Jamba Heart was summoned from another dimension, many people thought that this Void Termina originated from Kirby's dimension. As mentioned previously, other sources outside of the game mention that Void Termina is from another dimension.
This was also the reason why many people didn't believe the premise of Kirby being void, since they thought it didn't make sense how a sealed void Termina that hadn't been reincarnated yet would coexist with a Kirby, which is supposed to already be a reincarnated void Termina. However, even if you still don't believe in those theories, there is still nothing that explains this rebirth cycle that would involve having Zero and Void coexist with each other. Like I said, despite Void already being reborn as Zero, somehow a Void would have to exist or come back if Zero-2 were to be conceived. And now, if you bring Kirby into that matter, the same thing applies. Also, considering Kirby is described to be a young child, that would mean that Void had to have been reborn not too long ago, if Kirby is involved in this. And if Zero-2 was conceived after Zero's death, then that means that another Void would have to have been reborn. Now, as far as we know, Zero and even Dark Matter predates Kirby's existence, since Dark Nebula was sealed from a time where none of the main cast were aware of its presence. And another thing that's odd here is that Dark Nebula is called Dark Zero in the Japanese version. Does this mean that Dark Nebula is actually another raw reincarnation of Void? Probably not, but who knows. But even if you ignore all of this, there is another problem that resides from something that was yet again removed from the English version. This states that dreams, darkness, soul, heart, all chaos and possibilities assemble within its substance, being born as the origin and ancestor of all. Given this, we are led to believe that Void Termina is the origin of all things, possibly being the origin of the entire universe itself. So once again, how exactly does Void come back after it was the origin of all things? Now, this applies to any dimension. There's always a Void associated with one dimension. So again, how does Void come back if it's already been reborn by itself? This doesn't even apply to Zero or Kirby, it applies to just directly Void itself. Now, this translation of the pause screen is one many people have seen and based their knowledge off of. However, it's not the actual accurate translation of it because Japanese is very hard to interpret in English. The whole part where it talks about dreams, darkness, soul, and heart, these were actually supposed to be stated as 4 distinct matters that make up the entire universe, supposedly. One being dream matter, soul matter, heart matter, and dark matter. Now, I can't be so sure of things. For one, I am not a Japanese speaker, so whether these matters are supposed to be physical things or whatever else, I can't really tell. And whether they're suggesting that the dark matter is the living dark matter that we see throughout the series or a separate inorganic dark matter, I can't really be so sure. There's also the part where it says being born as the origin and ancestor of all. This is actually worded differently in the accurate translation, as so I've heard from others, supposedly from those that are actual Japanese speakers. They say that it's actually worded as the ancestor of the origin of all. Now, I have no idea what this is supposed to mean. The fact that they put ancestor before origin completely astounds me, because is this implying that there is another being that is the ancestor of Void and essentially created Void, which in return was the origin of the universe, therefore creating the universe? Or since it's talking about Void being the ancestor, saying that this ancestor is Void itself, yet it's also the ancestor of the origin of Void? I have no clue what this is supposed to mean. Here is what I originally thought before seeing all of this nonsense. So let's say before the universe began, there was a Void. At this point of non-existence, there was no positive or negative emotion and energy for Void to be influenced off of. Therefore, this Void had no sentience, and it was just a culmination of all the 4 distinct matters. Then it rebirthed itself as the universe. It became the Big Bang. Therefore, the entire universe is made up of these 4 distinct matters. There was no good, and there was no evil. There was no living matter, only matter that would eventually develop into sapient life forms would possess the ability to turn into a great good and a great evil. With Void being the Big Bang, or rather the origin of everything, it would have to be the origin of the ancestor of all. See, it's switched. This ancestor would be a Void Termina that came as a result of this Big Bang. I don't know. Void Termina somehow has to come back in order for this to work. This Void Termina exists before any other life forms would exist, therefore it is the ancestor of all living matter. Now, this Void Termina instead reincarnates not into neutral non-living matter like its originator, but now, due to it now being a living sentient itself, it's able to reincarnate based off of the energies across the universe, whether that be positive energies or negative energies. It can now reincarnate as a pure raw being made up of one of the 4 matters.
It may not make a whole lot of sense, but this is what I chalk most of this up to, since this basis of Void Termina's rebirth doesn't really add up, let alone when it's further associated with these appearances of Zero, Zero 2, and Kirby. On a bright note, if there is an ancestor or a being that may have created Void, the origin, that could explain how Void keeps coming back. But again, who knows, the pause screen could just mean that Void is also the ancestor. After all, that's what it actually says. It's the ancestor of the origin of all. How could there be an ancestor placed before the origin if the origin is quite literally the origin of everything? What's worse about all of this is that despite the pause screens being purposely vague, it may not ever be explained ever again. And that's the problem. If you don't understand what is being said in the first place, then what's the point? There's too much conjecture instead of actual knowledge. It's fine for things to be vague and unknown to let the audience speculate, but when it's to the point where you're not explaining what the audience should know, the basis of what you're implying to the audience, then that's a problem. Now, since Kuzumaki or whoever established this Void Termina concept, it's up to him or whoever to determine how previous story concepts fits into this newfound concept, that being Zero, Zero 2, and Kirby. Now, I know a lot of you are probably saying that I'm taking this way too seriously, and you're probably right to be honest, but the point is, what exactly am I supposed to take from this? I understand that a lot of stuff is left unanswered solely for leaving room for imagination, but once again, it doesn't help that what is told to us isn't specific enough for it to make sense in the first place. What am I supposed to take from these exposition dubs? What am I supposed to take from Galacta appearing for the millionth time, all for the purpose of giving the viewers a clue of his placement in the timeline? What am I supposed to take from all of this, especially when the developers go out of their way to clarify and explain additional lore and incite the viewers to put the pieces together? Clearly, they also treat it as something to put your mind to, as so does the majority of the fanbase. But when you have pause screens that require you to have 20 questions trying to define what a straightforward plot point or concept is supposed to mean, then that creates an issue with putting your mind and imagination into interpreting the story. Because again, there needs to be a basis on what is supposed to be known, and therefore from that you can use your own imagination to interpret what more that basis is supposed to mean, not where you have to struggle to decipher what the basis is in the first place. Speaking of there being 20 questions over a story concept, let's talk about another huge story concept. That being another dimension. A concept within a concept. Just like how it's a dimension within a dimension, or something like that. Each Void Termina is individually supposed to be linked with their core dimension, right? So the Shining Void that was linked to another dimension has been moved over to the main dimension. So there may not be many, if not no, previous reincarnations of Shining Void in another dimension, especially if it's been sealed this entire time. However, even with this factor, I decided to put Shadow or parallel Kirby and Dark Mind in this ambiguous placement that's associated with another dimension. Now, the reason why I did this is because it has to deal with something else. Something that deeply goes into theory territory. Now, get ready. This is going to be a whole lot to dive into. As we know, Shadow Kirby and Dark Mind originate from the mirror dimension. Now, if Void were to exist in the mirror dimension as it exists in all dimensions, then there will be no way for it to reincarnate as Zero. The mirror world is a place that holds a lot of positive energy, for it's a place that can make wishes come true. Thus, this means that Void in actuality may have reincarnated into the Shadow Kirby in that dimension. Now, considering Dark Mind, the way he was brought into existence was by none other than Zero in the main world. Let me explain. Zero from Dreamland 3 spread its darkness and malice throughout the skies. This includes the Amazing Mirror, for it is located in the sky. This caused the Amazing Mirror to create a reflection of Zero in the mirror dimension, which was inevitably Dark Mind. Dark Mind's presence is what made the mirror dimension and the Amazing Mirror itself transform into a hostile zone that would only reflect evil things. After all, in the official manuals, Dark Mind is referred to as a sinister presence that invaded the mirror world, implying that it's alien towards the dimension, further meaning that it didn't originate from there. Now, I won't say for certain that the Shadow Kirby from the Amazing Mirror is exactly an incarnation of Void, because beings from the normal world seem to already have a clone of itself present in the mirror world. Dark Meta Knight before Dark Mind corrupted him may have just been a normal Meta Knight. So who knows whether Shadow Kirby may be a being born by its reflection, or a being born from Void. Going further with this, you could possibly say that the Voids before the Kirbys existed were actually reflections of each other just like everybody else. So therefore their lives extended onto the Kirby incarnations, which would still make them reflections of each other, but reincarnations of Void at the same time. Now with this whole reflection business, there is also another version of Kirby that is supposedly a type of other reflection from the normal Kirby. This being the Shadow Kirby that's introduced in Kirby Fighters Deluxe. Now considering this Kirby has a completely different personality, has a design hinting towards him being a parallel boss, and most of all, him being fought in another dimension, many people rightfully assume that this Kirby is actually parallel Kirby despite being called Shadow Kirby, especially considering we see the Shadow Kirby from Amazing Mirror canonically appear in a later game. However, despite all of this, even in official posts and in recent games, this parallel Kirby is portrayed as the same Shadow Kirby from Amazing Mirror despite these design changes. Now what confirms this is that one of the pause screens from Kirby Fighters 2 says that he was born from the mirror and he is the guardian of the mirror world. But does this really confirm this? Let's take a look at where the Shadow Kirby is fought. He's fought in another dimension, and in Kirby Fighters 2, he is fought in the same battlefield where all the other parallel bosses fight in. Furthermore, those bosses were all born from the Black Mirror that was also present in this battlefield. Not to mention, we know that parallel beings originate from another dimension, so it seems that another dimension is the Black Mirror's mirror world, depending if the Black Mirror is canon or not. This means that this Shadow Kirby was born from this mirror, which means he is actually parallel Kirby. Well, hold on. What about the parallel bosses in the actual canon? How were they born? Because the Black Mirror and the parallel bosses that came from it was all from a game that was deemed as not entirely canon. So let's strictly go to the main canonical series for a bit, so we could get a good look on how parallel bosses work. The parallel bosses in the actual canon were born as doppelgangers, when the small Jamba hearts corrupted the normal forms of the parallel bosses. So as far as we know, this means that the parallel bosses weren't born from the Black Dimensional Mirror if we're considering the mirror to be in the main canon. But how does this explain this Shadow Kirby in the main canon that is depicted as a parallel creature? He clearly wasn't born from a Jamba heart. He was born from a dimensional mirror, as the pause screen confirms. Furthermore, how does this explain the other parallel bosses that weren't created from the Jamba heart? Well, the explanation for this comes from a Nintendo Dream magazine, and the information is very iffy. It states that the parallel bosses from Team Kirby Clash were brought forth from the world being out of balance due to Termina tampering with the Black Mirror. However, it also says that because of that, they were also directly born from this action, hence why Dark Termina was also born. Now, what's odd here is that these parallel bosses are implied to have been directly born all at once instead of already pre-existing in line with their original forms. Much similar to how the Mirror World variants already coexisted in union with their original forms. What I mean by this is that these parallel beings did not exist at some point while their original forms have always existed. After all, the ones that were created by the Jamba Hearts were only formed after the Dark Hearts made contact with their originals. However, this Japanese magazine's wording suggests that these parallel bosses were created strictly by Termina's actions, which seems very baseless. What makes more sense, and what I'm going to lead myself to believe, is that they had already existed beforehand and Termina had just accidentally brought them forth. Dark Termina, the supposed parallel variant of Termina, is the only one that would make sense to be born directly from him in the Black Mirror. Another thing they touch upon is that this Dark Termina that was born directly from the Black Mirror had also gave birth to King D Mind through the mirror by using its own thoughts. Okay, so the magazine first talks about Kirby and Amazing Mirror, saying that it started off as evil minds were copied and born in the dimensional mirror. Yes, this did happen, but it happened due to Dark Mind influencing the original copies of that mirror world, which transformed them into the dark copies we know today. But what's happening in this game is a bit unclear and doesn't make much sense. This notion from this magazine that is Termina and Dark Termina creating these parallel beings just from thoughts doesn't really add up. Especially this part right here when it talks of Dark Termina, a being that was already created from the mirror, has its evil mind accumulate into King D Mind, which is why Dark Mind appears inside of it despite Dark Mind already being a part of King D Mind. Yeah, it's pretty wild. Let's just say for now that these parallel beings already existed beforehand and Termina just brought them forth through the mirror. However, that still doesn't explain how exactly these parallel bosses were created or born. Well, it seems that canonically, parallel bosses are created through the Jamba Heart, and hypothetically, if the Black Mirror does exist in the main canon, which seems to be given this Shadow Kirby and this Kirby Fighters 2 pause screen, then that means beings can also be born from the mirror. You see, Tyranza giving form to Dark Tyranza is the only thing that makes sense because it's himself, not anyone else, being reflected from the mirror, creating a dark reflection. Much the same way Dark Mind was created from Zero being reflected through the mirror. Plus, there is another reason why this is the only one that makes sense. Unlike the other parallel bosses, Tyranza has never actually been in another dimension. Now, this goes into my next point on how these parallel bosses may have been created. So, the Jamba Heart that made these parallel beings was originally located in another dimension. It's entirely possible that a Dark Heart could have came across Susie and Landia since they were also in another dimension at some point. This would then create their parallel counterparts. However, we can't ascribe everything just to this one assumption. After all, it still doesn't explain how Kirby has this supposed parallel version of himself when he's never made contact with a Dark Heart and has never been in the vicinity of the Black Mirror to the point where it would create a reflection of himself like it did with Tyranza and Dark Tyranza. The only thing that tallies with parallel Kirby existing is the fact that Kirby has been inside another dimension before. So now let's say a being that let alone has made contact with another dimension automatically has a parallel version of itself born within this parallel world. But if this is the case, then wouldn't there be a parallel Margalore, parallel Highness, parallel Galacta Knight, parallel Bandana D, parallel Haltmann, parallel Mage Sisters, and maybe even a parallel Lord Starcutter? All of them at one point had been in another dimension. Well, some of these have actually had their original variants get exposed to a Jamba Heart, one of which is Highness, which also doesn't make much sense. Instead of creating a parallel version of himself, the game explains that something else different happened entirely. So, the darkness that was already inside of Highness completely transformed into an entire Jamba Heart, despite the fact that the first Jamba Heart had to be filled with not just Highness as a last resort, but the other Mage Sisters, and with all the other Dark Hearts piled on top of that. So, the Jamba Heart's darkness completely encapsulates Highness, which transforms him into Corrupt Highness. Somehow here, there isn't a parallel Highness created as an after effect. Maybe it's because all of the darkness was entirely concentrated on him, so therefore there was no leftover darkness that remained to create a parallel clone or whatever. Who knows? But going back to parallel clones getting created from being within another dimension, this still wouldn't explain how Dark Mind or King D Mind would be able to exist. Well, then again, D Mind in particular was especially said to be supposedly created by Dark Tyranza's thoughts of a powerful warrior when looking through the mirror. But something that is interesting is how it's Dark Mind that is born from the Black Mirror. Zero, or rather, a parallel Zero isn't created. The same way how there isn't a Dark Zero or a Shadow Zero in the mirror dimension. Both of Zero's reflections in the mirror world and the parallel world are just Dark Mind. This ties into what I mentioned earlier of what goes into theory territory. That being the answer as to why these two Shadow Kirbys are both called Shadow Kirby. It's because they are the same characters, but they're actually separate characters. Now hear me out and follow along. The amazing mirror which reflected good things eventually became corrupted by Zero, who was already treated or portrayed as the embodiment of evil, even back when Void wasn't conceptualized by their creators. The mirror then only became capable of creating evil reflections, hence why there are dark copies of Meta Knight, DDD, and so forth. However, if Zero is already the manifestation of raw evil, then how do you create an evil reflection of it? How do you create an evil reflection of evil itself? The result of this equation is that a greater or different type of evil is born, and that is Dark Mind. This is why Dark Mind isn't called Dark Zero, because it isn't a direct copy of Zero, unlike the other Mirror World variants such as Dark Meta Knight and Shadow DDD, who are technically direct copies of their originals. Zero and Dark Mind are different entities, but are one and the same. This can also explain why Dark Mind isn't considered a part of the Dark Matter race as shown in one of the Kirby Anniversary books. Now all of this also applies to the Black Mirror, which would create similar dark copies. Again, notice how there is no parallel Zero, but there is a Dark Mind, the same way how there is also no Dark Zero present. There are no Dark Zeros or parallel Zeros in these mirror dimensions because Zero can't really have a direct evil copy of itself. While there are differences between mirror clones and parallel clones that makes them separate, that being where the mirror clones' copies are actually full-fledged beings with personal experiences, while the parallel ones are just premature apparitions of negativity within a person, Zero in this matter is not inhibited to those differences because it's the purest form of evil. Therefore, no matter what type of evil reflection is created, it would automatically be Dark Mind. Think of it as a number line. The inverse of positive 1 would be negative 1. The number 0 is not bound to have an inverse because it's the origin point of the number line. The same with R0, since it's the rawest or origin point of evil. It can't be reflected by evil itself, which is why there are no different forms of 0 such as parallel 0 or dark 0. There can't be a negative 0. This is why all of these reflections are just Dark Mind, and this is why they are the same character, but are two separate entities. From this, I also apply the same to these two Shadow Kirbys that share the same name. They are also the same character, but separate entities that came from different dimensions, just like how there are two Dark Minds, but both came from different dimensions. However, since they're the same character, their appearances are treated as the same, and this is why these two Shadow Kirbys are depicted as the same character. Now the reason why I apply this to Kirby is because he is also one that would not entirely be affected by evil for a true evil reflection because he is an embodiment of positivity. Similar to Zero, who is the rawest form of evil, Kirby is the rawest form of good. Therefore, he doesn't really have a side of evil to be copied. However, since Kirby still isn't a pure form of evil like Zero, he still falls victim to having a contrasting dark clone in the mirrors, since the mirrors are reflecting bad things from good things. This is why these Shadow Kirbys are born. And again, since Kirby is a pure form of positivity, the Shadow Kirbys aren't inherently evil, but are rather directionless or dispirited. This is why Parallel Kirby and Shadow Kirby share different appearances and different personalities, just like the rest of the parallel and mirror counterparts. However, the two are still identical enough to each other to be treated as the same character, since they are the ones that are the most unaffected by the mirror, in contrary to the other parallel and mirror world variants. And this solves why these two are both called Shadow Kirby, because they are both the same character, but are separate characters. Now, this explanation may seem completely ridiculous, but that's my only take on why they are named and treated as the same character. For some reason, they are said outside of the game to be the same character, despite all other indications in-game proving otherwise, such as this Shadow Kirby being fought in literally another dimension, and appearing in the battlefield where all the other parallel bosses appear, and where the Black Mirror appears. Not to mention, in much more recent games, even after Star Allies, they are still depicted as separate characters because they still show the gray Kirby as Shadow Kirby instead of the purple parallel Kirby. So they aren't the same character. This is why I'm so inclined on believing my ridiculous theory, because there's nothing else to explain this. Oh, but no, since this one pause screen in his Twitter post says that this Shadow Kirby is just one character, that being the purple parallel Kirby, I have to be led to believe that despite all other factors. Now, if I want to stretch things, when this pause screen says that this Shadow Kirby is the guardian of the mirror world, I could just make a far-fetched claim and say that it's referring to the Black Mirror's mirror world, but that's most likely not the case.
I know it seems like I'm nitpicking very hard right now, but keep in mind that this is all supposed to be structures within the story. These subjects are all supposed to be the foundation behind a lot of the major plot points in world building. And if there's this much contradictions and confusion over something as simple as this, then that's a problem.
Listen, I made this video because supposedly after Star Allies, the next stage in the Kirby franchise will start. And if this is the case, then changes need to be made. If this next stage is going to introduce new story concepts and expand upon old ones, then it all needs to be explained in a much better way to give everything a much greater sense of legitimacy. Because as of now, nothing feels legitimate. Everything that is told to us never seemed true or accurate. Most notions that viewers get from the game's story implications are wrong, and this needs to be fixed. This next chapter of Kirby is presumably going to be primarily covering the Ancients, whom were hinted at throughout the series. Now, the problem with this is that you now have to consider previously established ancient characters in this premise, and these ancient characters are background characters. We've never been shown the history of Popstar, but these background characters imply that Planet Popstar has probably existed long before Kirby or maybe even any of the main cast was even born. After all, Crowley Rattler, who is in disguise of Popstar, is stated to have existed since the dawn of time. Who knows if this is an exaggeration or mistranslation or not, but as far as we are aware, there is nothing going against this possibility. There are ancient characters such as Krakow and Wispy who have existed for ages. There are many other background characters that have either been descended from past generations or have simply been settled on Popstar for many generations, presumably. Not to mention, there are many powerful artifacts that seem to be stationed on Popstar for unexplained reasons. There's a dimensional mirror, the Star Rod, the Fountain of Dreams, and maybe even the magic paintbrush in the Mask of Dark Bonds that just so happened to exist and was attainable this entire time. Maybe it was locked in one of DD's chests from Squeak Squad, and that's how DD managed to acquire it so conveniently. After all, Dark Nebula was sealed in one of those chests in which DD or barely anyone was aware of. This also means that at some point in the distant past, Dark Nebula had also been prominent on Popstar. He possibly predates even Zero's existence. Anyways, right now Another Dimension seems to be the main locale of the world building, especially when it comes to the Ancients. Yet we're still technically not sure how barely any of its setting works. We don't know how the concept of time in it works. Presumably it's an indefinite length of time or beyond time, in which, how does that work? Especially when it comes to determining the timeline of the Ancients, which, as we are told, are in a foregone or antecedent passage of time. We don't know how the parallel bosses are born. We don't know if the Black Mirror is canon. There's still a lot to cover about Another Dimension as a setting. Now, I guess you could say that Kirby's setting doesn't focus on Another Dimension. While that may be true, these parallel bosses and the Ancients still come from that, making it a huge mark in the overall lore. Heroes in Another Dimension in fact solely introduced the parallel bosses in the canonical storyline, which only seems to be just to replace them as EX bosses since the game was rushed, but that's just me.
The thing about this is, we haven't even explored most of Kirby's universe yet. There's yet still more to cover about it. After all, why was Highness and his clan supposedly banished to the end of Kirby's universe if the supposed Ancients originate from another dimension? Why is Stardream, who was created by the Ancients, why is it in this universe if it has a hold of Galacta, whom is mostly in another dimension? In fact, how many dimensions are there in its entirety? Is there an infinite number since another dimension is beyond time and space? We barely even explored Kirby's dimension, for Kirby's planet is literally located at the far edge of it. How will all of this be covered in this next chapter of the franchise? And on top of all this, there's still a lot to cover from what's left over from this chapter. Sectonia and Dark Matter Blade are still technically alive, Marx is still out there, Shadow Kirby is outside of the mirror world, supposedly along with Dark Meta Knight. Speaking of which, what's up with the dimensional mirror? Nothing has really changed about it ever since it was corrupted. Does this mean that Dark Mind is still out there? There's now a reincarnated void that exists. There's also the whole continuity enigma of Galacta, there's the Ancients, and there's literally the vast conundrum of another dimension. And I don't think all of this can be solved or explained by some little pause screen. This next stage of Kirby needs to start showing their stories in exposition, not telling it. Now, what I also have to understand is that Kirby is a kids franchise, so I'm probably not going to have Galacta timeline number 47 answered for me, and I guess that's okay. But I will still be expecting improvements from this franchise.
The concept of Kirby lore has always been somewhat clever, so I hope that it would be utilized much better in future games.